Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that took a summer break because the internet was closed. And how are you,
I'm very well, thank you. And how are you?
Yeah, not bad. People who are patrons will have heard our pre-episode rambling where we talked about the fun things we got up to in the break that we had. We had an actual break, no special episodes, I'm afraid. There will be a special episode after this one that I've been holding back, but basically over summer, we took some time off and we actually saw each other in real life several times, and we've seen other people in real life several times, and it's kind of nice to be slowly approaching normality. But actually this episode, I don't think we're talking much about COVID, so we can kind of touch on that later, I guess, in another episode if things change. But fingers crossed, life is slowly becoming more normal.
Fingers crossed.
So I'm just going to power on straight into the headlines. And this week there's two headlines on the same topic. So first, MPs condemn Biden over shameful US withdrawal from The Times, and chaos and bloodshed as last flight leaves Kabul from The Guardian. So what was that all about, Rob? I think people can probably guess if they know where Kabul is, but I think people would have struggled to miss this story.
Yeah, this was kind of like if we had done a summer episode, I would have done it on this topic probably, which was dominating news headlines for about 2 or 3 weeks, really. It was about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and basically how quickly that withdrawal turned into the return of the Taliban taking back over Afghanistan. This was something that was planned, that people knew was going to happen and could have happened a lot sooner. So even though it's happened under the Biden regime, these wheels were put in motion ever since Trump kind of lost the election back in late November 2020. One of the big reports they had out there was that Trump was going to withdraw troops from the US before Biden became president. And a lot of his generals stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. That's too quick. However, it is something that Biden's continued with, and they've set the wheels in motion. And because everybody's known about it, it kind of gave the Taliban a while to prepare for this. And this may have led to the capitulation happening quicker than everybody thought it would. Most US intelligence had predicted that it would take at least 3 months for the Taliban to take control, if that was it, but it appeared to be a number of weeks when all of a sudden they were in Kabul. We saw those pictures where you heard of the standing Afghanistan prime minister fleeing the country, and then you saw all of those people trying to escape via the airport and loads of refugees trying to get out of the country as well. So it's been, I think, the whole speed of this situation is what's been so shocking and has really helped it garner front page attention.
I think if anyone's seen any newspaper headlines or anything in the last few weeks, you'll have seen that picture of everyone in that plane leaving Kabul. That was, I've been on planes where I felt I was cramped, but that was, it was literally the back of a cargo plane full of people. And apparently also people were kind of trying to jump on the plane as it left because they saw it as their last way out of Kabul. So it was obviously, I didn't want to make this part too light, really. It was obviously horrible to see. As you say, people were saying, it might take 3 months for the Taliban to take over. We essentially knew the Taliban were going to take it over, but it's kind of shocking how quickly it happened. I think that was probably the big surprise. People were expecting this to maybe take a few months and it would be a slow thing where people could maybe get themselves out, and suddenly it was just like that, and seeing people evacuated and all of that.
And it's been yesterday, as we record this, saw the 20th anniversary of the Twin Towers disaster, and that was maybe the event that was a catalyst for the US invasion of Afghanistan, and then their kind of subsequent occupation is kind of the wrong word, but at least they always kept a military presence in Afghanistan as soon as they'd helped the non-Taliban forces take over in that country. So to see sort of 20 years of democracy and progress gone in a couple of weeks was heartbreaking to see. A lot of people kind of wondered what if you were a soldier who'd fought for that, what had you fought for if it could all come apart so quickly? So that was quite depressing, and was something where people could reflect on our actions. Was that a worthy war? But you've also got to look at it at the other impacts it's having on, particularly women and girls in Afghanistan who are now having to live under a totalitarian regime of religious fundamentalists that don't believe in their right to education or to read. There were stories of educated women feeling they had to burn their diplomas so they wouldn't get targeted by the Taliban, etc. So it's a heartbreaking loss in many ways to see it go so quickly. I did really want to just quickly touch on some of the reasons why it went so quickly or quicker than US forces thought it would. So first of all, like, the Taliban were prepared for this. Like, it wasn't a secret that the US wanted to get out, and all of this thing was sort of coordinated. So any Taliban offensive would have been postponed or been waiting in the wings until the US troops had gone. Then they were ready to strike. Secondly, you've got the problem that the existing Afghan government there is seen as maybe a side partner, or isn't quite as well respected by the people or other outside organizations. So, for example, Trump, while he was in power, did actually negotiate a ceasefire with the Taliban, but he did that without the involvement of the current Afghan government. So for the Taliban, at least, they kind of felt that agreement was between US soldiers and them. They didn't really have to respect the Afghan government in the same way. So as soon as the US military might was gone, that certainly left quite a big power vacuum that the Taliban were able to fill. I've also heard sort of quotes that, the Taliban were ready to strike, and they were ready to strike these soldiers who were out in camps in the middle of nowhere. Their supply lines had either been cut, or they were having very few supplies given from central government. If you're a soldier in the middle of nowhere and you get your rations for the next 4 weeks and they're moldy potatoes, you're not going to be very motivated to fight for your country. And the reason it happened so quickly was because there was actually very little fighting on the ground that happened. It was incredibly easy for the Taliban to come up to these posts and say, look, like, we would like this post, please. Do you really want to give your life for this government that's not protecting you, that's sort of insulted you by giving you these 4-week rations of moldy potatoes? Or do you just want to quietly give it to us? And most people decided that the easier option in that wasn't to stand up and fight, but to allow the Taliban to take over. And that's not to say that, that probably wasn't an easy choice for many people. As I've said, it's, heartbreaking for, many people who believe in democracy and those people within Afghanistan who fought to get the Taliban out. This would have been the last thing they wanted, but they were really left with no, it was that or certain death. What can you do in that situation? Very little. So it was that incredible capitulation of the Afghan army and that kind of lack of fighting, which meant that it wasn't 3 months, it was a few weeks. And almost as soon as it started hitting the headlines that the Taliban was starting to take back over, it appeared that they were in Kabul. And by then it was too late for anybody to go back. The US suddenly couldn't take back control without launching another full-scale invasion again. And that's something that President Biden has been very clear that they're not going to do. The US does want to draw a line under this conflict. So, that appears to be, the Taliban being in control appears to be the new status quo in Afghanistan. So we'll see how the rest of the world reacts to that.
Yeah, I think you touched on a few things there. I just want to add a few more points to. So you mentioned about how they... You mentioned they had like the deal signed, and then there was also kind of there's kind of seems to be this kind of idea of like the new Taliban, like they're different this time around that they're trying to present. And you also talked about that, like the effect this is having on women and girls, and some of them like burning their certificates and things like that. I would point people like this is our pre-main story part, because this happened when we were away. I would definitely encourage people to go listen to the Guilty Feminist emergency episode they did when this was all happening, because I think it made a lot of important points, but also it has some Afghans like being rightfully angry about what happened and explaining how they feel. And I think that's probably a better time capsule of what it was like in those weeks after, and also the kind of feelings that people will still be having in Afghanistan, because it's not something we can really speak to. So I would listen to that episode. I'll point people that way. It'll be in the show notes. So kind of what was the kind of fallout? We've got a few more headlines actually. So I think the next one we're going on to is big-hearted Britain to take 20,000 refugees from the Express.
Yeah, so with the Taliban coming in, a lot of people obviously clearly not a fan of them or fan of them in government. So that creates a lot of refugees as people try to flee the country. And one of the big questions was how many refugees the UK was going to take. That headline is from The Express, who were trying to paint a very positive picture of it. 20,000 does seem like a big number in isolation. But there have been a lot of people who criticize this plan as essentially not enough. I've put in there a link to a website, BBC, which shows you lots of, the number of different countries that take in the number of Afghans in 2020. So you compare our 20,000 to Pakistan's 1.4 million that they've taken in 2020. Iran has taken 780,000 in. Germany has taken, according to this article, 181,000 into the country. Our 20,000 kind of pales in, it seems to be insignificant compared to those type of numbers. And many people felt that as the UK and the US, and it was sort of those NATO allies that were responsible for starting that conflict in the first place, maybe they should take more responsibility for their actions, essentially, by allowing more people back into the country. Now, in their defence, the British government has said that they've been focusing on those who have worked for the UK government and could be targeted by the Taliban as a result. And although that those left behind, those who have been left behind, the UK is in the hundreds rather than in the thousands. Many kind of criticised the speed of that withdrawal and the way that was prioritised by the UK. There was also kind of a very bizarre story I saw, which was, you've got these planes leaving, and like you said, you saw those pictures of those planes where people were rammed in, desperate to get out. There was a plane that left with just rescue animals, and essentially they weren't allowed to take extra people on the flight. That was like, no, that one's just for somebody getting rescue cats and dogs, essentially, out of Afghanistan. Now, I am up for rescuing pets, but personally, I would place human life on a higher level, or, people who would be targeted by the Taliban rather than these dogs that have been looked after for a while that might be let out by I don't know what the Taliban are going to do to those dogs. Basically, they're going to target them the same as they would people who've worked for the UK government. So there are lots of questions about priorities there and how they were handled. There's a lot of useful links that I've put in there that we can direct our listeners to that compare a lot of different countries. There's been a variety of different responses from NATO allies. It appears to be the kind of like the USA is taking around about 30,000, Canada 20,000. In that independent article, that number slightly differs from the Germany figure I've got. It says Germany's going to take about 20,000 as well. So it appears that all of these NATO allies did have around about that number of people who are working closely with their government organisations, and they are looking to get them out of the country as soon as possible. But yeah, a lot of people have questioned if that's actually enough, and the time scale as well, because 20,000 sounds like a lot, but that might be quite a few over a period of years when, years is clearly insufficient when we've just talked about how the Taliban were able to take over in 3 weeks. That's what you don't know what's going to happen to those people in that time. So, and at the heart of that all, and I think at the heart of those decisions, one man has been put in the UK media's ire, essentially, and I think that's the next headline we're going to look at.
Yeah, just before we move on to that, I just wanted to kind of add in, we were talking about numbers quite a bit there. I know some people will sometimes say, oh, well, it makes sense. Obviously part of the reason Pakistan will take in more, and it's not just because their government has said so, like they will understand that being next door, people are going to walk to the nearest country. People might not want to come to the UK. Yeah, they share a land border, it's easier, etc. One thing to be aware of, and I don't have a specific link right now to the podcast I heard this on, but it was probably discussed on several, to be fair, but I definitely heard on news podcasts I was listening to about how difficult that actually is, despite the fact, you might be like, oh, it's only how many miles, but it is a very difficult road, especially when you've also got to contend with the Taliban, as if you're one of those people who's trying to get out, who was like helping the UK, the US, etc. So, that's part of the reason, like you said, this is our fault for going in there in the first place, and these people have been put at risk because of their association with the UK, the US, etc. That's why we feel these people should be extracted in that situation. As you said, maybe only a few hundred people there left behind, which sounds better than I thought it was. But also, there's going to be, other things, extended family, etc., that may need to be evacuated for the same reason. And so just leaving those people behind seems, it's not okay, really. I mean, there's no other way to put it. And as you said, that kind of leads to a bit of there was a lot of finger pointing, I would say, in the cabinet around this and in the government at large. So our next headline on that is UK cabinet ministers at war in Afghanistan blame game from The Independent.
Yeah. So the man who was at the centre of this row was our Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab. Most noticed by the papers was the fact that while the Taliban was making quick advances through the country, he was on holiday. Like most MPs will take a 6 to 7 week break over the summer period, as we have. And Dominic Raab was on his holidays in Corfu, I believe, at the time. And some people felt that he should have cancelled that holiday and come back short to try and deal with the crisis. Also, more news stories emerged that as people at the Foreign Office who weren't on holiday were trying desperately hard to, arrange papers and arrange transport to get UK translators out of the country, Raab was essentially asked to make a phone call, and allegedly he didn't make that phone call or refused to do so. This is an allegation that Dominic Raab denies. Some people say that he was paddleboarding whilst the incident happened. Raab's defense of that was that the sea was closed, which is a comment that has got much attention from people because nobody really understands how you can close the sea. Quite a large area for somebody to suddenly take control of and close entirely. But that aside, he's certainly not been one of the MPs that has come out of this particularly well, and there are a number of questions that Raab has had to answer, particularly as part of the select committee, and they feel like he should be held responsible for. So, like, why he went on that holiday in the first place. Many people have said that it was the wrong decision to even go. He would have been aware that the Taliban were advancing probably when he decided to go, and then the situation really got bad towards the end of it. Maybe as Foreign Secretary, you should have some vision on those sort of things. Going back to that Independent article, that was actually some of like the briefing war of words that came out in the papers. One paper basically said that Boris Johnson asked Raab to come back, and Raab's decision was to say. Another newspaper briefed that Raab said that he only stayed because the Prime Minister said it was okay for him to do so. Like, Raab wanted to come back, and the Prime Minister said, no, you're on your holiday, you stay there, we can deal with this. So it's bizarre that you've got people right at the head of government that appear to be briefing against each other in national newspapers. Secondly, we've talked about those translators. A lot of people were kind of talking about when he spoke to UK ambassadors and when he last spoke to any ambassador actually that was in the region. There are allegations that he hadn't spoken to like the Pakistan ambassador in over 6 months. And when you've got something where you imagine like loads of refugees might be coming to that country, you might see that as a strategic ally to get on side, or at least somebody to touch base with if this is happening. The fact that this doesn't seem to have happened, again, is worrying and puts his role as Foreign Secretary under the microscope, and people wondering if he should be fired or resign for those actions. It must be noted, and it's something that we've said on this podcast several times, it does appear that it takes an awful lot to get fired from this cabinet or resign. We've talked that Boris Johnson has quite a small talent pool when it comes to cabinet ministers who are loyal to him, and he appears to reward loyalty rather than ability, in my opinion. And in my opinion, I think Dominic Raab would be a foreign secretary that would have gone as a result of this under any other prime minister that we've had, or at least come very close. The fact that it wasn't even raised as a question seriously within the cabinet and appears to have been brushed over as events have moved on and away from Afghanistan as the news cycle has continued. That really does raise a question mark of, is Boris Johnson ever going to reshuffle his cabinet? Is this the one we've got for the past 5 years? The only change that he's made has been the Hancock change, and that was enforced, and Hancock eventually resigned rather than being fired by Johnson. So that I think that gives you the kind of like scale or what somebody has to be done to get out of their job, and even then it took them to resign rather than Boris Johnson pulling the trigger.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we've touched on this thread a lot of times, but it very much seems like it's Boris's mates that he's got into the cabinet, and they will stay there as, you know. It has, as you say, that it's not just are they viable anymore in the way that it would have been in previous times. It's just, there has to be something so bad that they can't keep them around, which is kind of a shift, and a bit more Trumpian and populist, I guess, in a certain way. Yeah, I don't think I have much to add other than, definitely a bad idea to decide to go on holiday when you're foreign secretary, and that kind of thing is in the offing. So, I don't have much more to add than you've said. I think we should probably move on to our main headline tonight, which actually we've got two more headlines here to read out, but these are our main story tonight with two headlines. First, Bojo's biggest gamble from The Sun, and then highest taxes since the war from The Telegraph. I'm contractually obliged to pronounce the war like that because I have watched Only Fools and Horses. So what's this story about, Rob?
This is the news that Boris Johnson is seeking a radical change to the way that national insurance is paid in order to fund a significant increase in money for the NHS. Essentially. And this has had quite the reaction, both from people from within his party and without, and might be, in my opinion, it's probably the most significant policy announcement this government has made since Brexit. And they had to do Brexit, and Brexit was a long time ago. Essentially, what has happened is that Boris Johnson is proposing a tax rise in national insurance to raise an extra £12 billion, 2 billion of that for Scotland and Wales, and the rest goes to England. He hasn't just decided to do this for a laugh or out of nowhere. The big reason, or at least Boris says the big reason, is COVID. Obviously, COVID has happened, and that has put the NHS under an immense amount of strain. And in those first few months of the pandemic, it was almost like the NHS had a blank check to go and get whatever they needed to save lives. We saw entire new Nightingale hospitals spring out of nowhere, and an immense effort from staff and those people who are planning to get all of that ready. But now it appears that all of that has to be paid for, and this is the way that Boris Johnson is proposing they do it. It's not only just a response to COVID in how much money it took to deal with COVID itself, but there's also a lot that comes from the increased NHS backlog that's caused, and the extra capacity that will be needed in hospitals to try and get through that backlog as quickly as possible. NHS waiting lists have often been a big talking point when it comes to the National Health Service, and it's probably no secret that there were quite long waiting lists even before COVID happened. Now that they were forced to postpone months of theatre operations and face-to-face appointments, the NHS now faces one of its biggest challenges trying to get through all of that. So it's clear that they need the extra money. However, this has more been promoted, I think, particularly by Boris Johnson, as a tax to help a social care crisis. So how you deal with elderly people who have to go into long-term care. This is something that has been a problem for maybe even a decade now, certainly noticeably so since Cameron's government, you could argue maybe before into Brown and Blair, but it's certainly become more acute during the last 10 years and did form the cornerstone of one of Theresa May's big campaign promises when she went ahead in the, not the 2017, in the 2017 election. And her proposed social care reform was one of those things that caused her campaign to stutter and trip up a little bit. You might remember her "nothing has changed" line when something clearly had changed in the way that she put that proposal forward. That social care plan was not received well by the elderly or those who felt they might have to sell their houses or this might force them to sell their house if they wanted social care in the future. This is an alternative strategy, and although it might not affect the elderly in the same way, it's certainly controversial for a number of other reasons that we're going to go into, but it certainly isn't a well-liked policy from even the opposition and from members within his own party.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. A phrase that gets bandied around a lot, I know, but it's I think we all know that COVID was going to cost money. I think the thing that's a bit weird about this is that it's for social care and it's going to then also be used to deal with COVID. I think that's the bit I find weird about all of this. I don't personally have a problem with a tax rise to national insurance. I know that Boris said he wouldn't do it, but I don't have a problem with it happening in order to support social care, because at some point we're going to have to pay for these things. That's how it works. I appreciate a higher tax on people who have lots and lots of money, or businesses might be another way to do it as well. But like personally, I'm like, if I have to pay more tax in order to do this, that's fine by me. But I think it's this, kind of weird how it's. I get that COVID has made the social care situation worse, but it's kind of a weirdly linked thing that feels odd, and I think that's probably why there's been more pushback on it.
Yeah, certainly, and it's. Like you say, it's a tough one. Like, as I understand that taxes have to rise a certain way if we want to pay for goods and services, particularly like the cost of COVID care was never going to be free. I understand that. But the way the government has gone about this is what is incredibly confusing to me, particularly the idea to put it on national insurance. So maybe that's the best place to start then. So it's a national insurance rise. And national insurance is what you always pay as a proportion of your income. So that immediately kind of takes out a large proportion of like the elderly in society who don't get an income anymore. I know they get a pension, but it doesn't target them as much as it does those of working age. So those of working age are definitely going to have to pay to fund the social care of the elderly. Very understandable. That's what happens. That's why elderly people get a pension. That's the way the system works. I understand that. But then when they've attached it to national insurance rather than income tax, that's raised a few eyebrows as well. So the way national insurance works, it doesn't really scale on the same factor as incomes. As the income. So there's a nice little graph here that the BBC say that how much more will employees pay. If you're earning around about £30,000 a year, you'll have to pay an extra £255 in national insurance. If you earn £100,000 a year, you'll have to pay an extra £1,130. But that doesn't really scale at the same way that income tax does. If they did it by income tax, the difference between those two figures would be far larger, and some people would argue it would be far more proportional, in fact, because those who are earning more should get far higher wages instead. Also, there have been a lot of people who are from outside the Conservative Party who have said there are other ways to fund a tax increase like this. For example, you could go for inheritance tax, for example. That's something that the Conservatives are naturally disinclined to raise because the vast majority of Conservative voters tend to be more wealthy. They tend to own bigger properties. They tend to want to make sure that their money goes to their children in whatever way possible. I think most parents would, but it's certainly an advantage that wealthier people have, that they can give their children a better head start in life if they're able to give a large amount of inheritance or sell their house and give that to their the profits of that to their children, rather than those on the lowest income who don't have that advantage. And Labour would certainly say it would be fairer to tax those people and increase something like inheritance tax rather than increase the burden on the poorest in society, essentially, is what Labour's saying. And it appears to be that, personally, for me, what the Conservatives have done here is they've thought of the best way to raise taxes that doesn't affect their core vote as much. So traditionally, you would say a Conservative voter is wealthier than average and older than average. So by avoiding things like inheritance tax, they've kind of tried to send a buffer against their core voters. However, what this does on the flip side is all of those red wall Conservatives we've been talking about for the past months, the reason why Boris Johnson is doing so well, the reason why Boris Johnson won those seats like Hartlepool up in the north and was making grounds into old Labour territory, where the Conservatives were finally making their breakthrough with the working class voter, saying, convincing them that Labour was now the party of the privileged and the middle class and the Conservatives the ones who stood up for the working man. That kind of undermines that entire message in one fell swoop. And it's kind of like my opinion that, even though this might not have such a big impact now with voters, when it starts to hit their pay package and there's only one person they can look to blame for that, that might start having an effect on the Conservatives losing some favour amongst the electorate. It's one of the stranger policy decisions I've seen go ahead from Boris Johnson, and it's not very. It might show how desperate may be too strong a word. It might show how much the COVID has affected the economy and how much he needs this money how much the government needs this money to get through this. The fact that he had to come up with such a bizarre solution to this problem. And it's been one that certainly key Conservative talking heads, one of those headlines you read, the highest taxes since the war, was a headline from the Telegraph. And the Telegraph, which Boris Johnson has said himself is the thing that he looks at and feels like is his bellwether for if he's doing well or not, that's his core vote. They've been screaming about this from the rooftops, that this is not something they agree with at all, and they feel it's kind of like a death knell of conservatism. The Conservatives have been the party of low tax. The 2019 manifesto said that they would not raise taxes. So to go back on that promise seems to undermine why a lot of people voted Conservative as well. Boris Johnson's excuse is nobody could plan for COVID. COVID was in nobody's manifesto. We've had to change our tune because of it, and I understand that to a degree. But personally, like I said, if you were looking to raise taxes to help pay for social care, 12 billion, which some sources and even the NHS themselves say may not be enough, the fact they've done it in such a convoluted way, in my opinion, to target national insurance rather than income tax or inheritance tax, really kind of undermines a lot of places where Conservatives are making gains in the public psyche. So a lot of places where the Conservatives were starting to make grounds in Labour seats, I feel they may lose those if these go ahead. Even though this was brought in on, I feel like the first we heard about this was on a Tuesday, and it was very quickly voted through Parliament by Wednesday or Thursday. There was a very quick debate, and it was won by a sizable Conservative majority of 71. So the rebellion amongst the Conservative MPs might not be as strong as the rebellion there was in the Conservative papers. But there certainly seems to be a fight there between those two factions of staying loyal or traditional conservatism, which this really seems to clash with.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing. It's turning around. Not only was it on the manifesto, but it is generally anti-conservative to increase taxes. I mean, we all knew it was coming, and that it would probably, it was going to happen with this government, some kind of tax increase. So, the fact that there is a tax increase in any way is not surprising. They have to get money from somewhere. There's no magic money tree, despite what may have been claimed in the past. I think it's interesting because I wonder, we talked about the red wall constituencies and a few other things and how that might be affected. And I think we're about to talk about how this has affected the Prime Minister's ratings in the polls as well, which is kind of a knock-on effect there. But I do wonder, for all of the nuance of which type of tax this is and how this affects people, and we've got a lovely article from the New Statesman that you can read in the show notes about how graduates end up paying more tax for various reasons and things like this. But I wonder if actually the main thing is going to be, well, he said he won't tax us, and he has. That sounds like that's such a simple, easy political argument for the other parties to make. It doesn't. That there's a lot of nuance going on that I think is not the kind of winning slogan. The slogan here is, I've already seen these adverts on Facebook, coming at you, which are like a picture of Boris, looking a bit derpy. I mean, there's plenty of those. And then above it, he said he wasn't going to tax you, lies. It's a very easy way to target someone. So, I mean, the question is whether you can keep targeting him over that until the next general election. I imagine it's more the kind of thing that might help push a prime minister out of the way before a general election, as opposed to being a general election. I mean, it can come up in a general election promise, but obviously, as we've said before, general election, long way away. I don't think I have much more to add specifically on that point. I just wanted to raise that. And I just want to be clear when I say that I'm happy paying more tax myself. I'm not saying I agree with the decision. It's just I could pay more tax and it would be fine. Obviously, I'd like to pay less tax. So would everyone. But you need to pay for things, unfortunately. And but I think, it is important to have the discussion, especially if people who are not as far into their careers as you and I are being taxed more. Then that's going to have we've already seen that with our generation, how much longer it takes people to get houses and stuff because they have less ready money to put away and save. And that's for various reasons. But, and the fact that houses cost more and stuff like that. There's a lot going on. I appreciate it's not as simple as these people are being taxed more, but definitely taxing people who are fresh out of university, or in some cases not even gone to university, just as they start their first jobs, more than people who are established in their careers, is problematic, because those people need to start to build up their own savings so that they can eventually buy a house or do whatever it is they want to do with their lives. So yeah, it's bad that it's
and it's things like even the lowest earners, like I can't remember what the thresholds are off the top of my head, so apologies for this, but there's a threshold, I think, of about 10 grand or something before you have to start paying income tax on what you earn over a year. Something like that. The same threshold for national insurance is far lower, which means that you might not pay income tax, but you will pay national insurance. So that's how it affects the very poorest in society. Exacerbated by the fact that universal credit, or at least the extra £20 people were getting, that's also been taken away. So if you take that away and then present them with more national insurance, that's like a double whammy that will really affect the poorest in society that way. And the fact that you're sort of doing it over 40 quid for these people, which means so much to them, or, an incredible amount to them with what they can do with their lives, compared to the extra £1,000 it is for somebody on 100 grand a week, that seems intrinsically unfair to me. And, personally, I think that is a bad way to run your tax system. I know it's maybe a lazy and overused argument, but, if you decided that we were going to tax Google or Amazon for the business they did there, and in some way that tax could be increased, that might be a far better source of income that most people would be happy with there being a higher tax on those corporations, rather than there being those minor increases in their taxes that have big impacts on family budgets and how they're going to plan for the future. So a lot to talk about there. And as you say, it's kind of, a general election is a long way away, but is it one of those things that forces Boris to the side if it really goes wrong? I don't think we're quite at Thatcher poll tax territory yet. I don't envisage there will be actual riots on the street about this, but it might just be that one warning from history there from Boris that Margaret Thatcher was an incredibly popular and effective leader for a vast number of years during her premiership. But it only took one badly misjudged policy to essentially lead to her downfall. It wasn't long after she had to retract on the poll tax that the Conservatives quietly moved her aside and found somebody else to replace her. So that might be why Boris should be looking over his shoulder when this policy
more concerned.
When this policy actually goes live, to see how much movement there will be.
Just one final point to add on tax. You mentioned, you said the personal allowance. You implied it's around 10 grand. It's actually over 12,500 now, and I think that's another thing that's so. I know we started working slightly different, a few years apart, but I remember one thing when I just started working, that while I didn't get a pay increase for a few years, I did really notice and feel as a recent graduate the increase in the personal allowance, which is the point before you are taxed, which went up from, I think, 11,000 and something to the 12,570 is now over several years during the start of my career. So that was without my company. I mean, my company should have been paying me more at that point, but that's how jobs go. You get on a salary and you have to argue to get an increase later on. But that during that period, I really did feel the effect of that, because it's exactly what we're describing. People who have just come out of university or have just started to work, getting essentially what is a slight pay increase because of the change in the personal allowance. And I think that probably, because that all happened either under a Conservative government or under a coalition, I think that probably did engender in that group of, a younger age group, a bit of good feeling towards the government that was just slowly reducing how much they were taxed. And then this, as you say, is quite a reversal there, and it's affecting that similar age group now negatively. So it's quite a big shift in kind of what feels like Conservative Party policy. I mean, obviously that was pre-Boris Johnson as leader, but it's something that was noticeable to me in my pay packet at the time. If it had been going the opposite way, I would have not been so happy. I mean, I wasn't happy with the Conservative government anyway. I mean, that's a personal thing, but if you were someone who was on side and suddenly like, oh, why am I getting less money? I can definitely see why you'd start to question it.
Yeah, certainly.
So shall we move on to how this is already affecting the Prime Minister's ratings? I believe we have a tweet from Britain Lex, who follows all these kind of things quite closely. Oh, wow, that's quite a drop. So there's that over the 6th to 8th of September. I appreciate that's just a single poll. I don't know if we have an aggregated poll, but there is a nice graphic there. I'm going to describe this for the reader. If you're in your podcast app and you have one of those snazzy podcast apps that shows you the artwork, I'll make sure this is the artwork for this section so you can read along at home. But yes, impact on the Conservative vote share. So they have the actual election results from the general election in 2019, and then they have a prediction for 2021 and a prediction for September 2021 based on the polling data. So you can have these are the estimated percentage share of the vote. So it's not like seats or anything. So the Conservatives won with 45% of the vote in the general election. They're estimated 43% for May, with Labour on 30%, which was down 3% from where it was before, and Lib Dems on 11%, and then the rest. Based on this new poll, they've dropped 6 percentage points. Labour's gone up a small bit, and then the other parties have kind of got a share of it. Interestingly, I think most of it's gone to, after Labour, most of it's gone to Reform, which isn't particularly surprising. You see some Conservative voters fall away there, I guess. But yes, that's the change. So a 6% drop is the takeaway there.
Yeah. And that's quite significant in itself. A drop of that level over a number of months would at least be alarming and shows a leaking of support to various different places. Like you say, +3 to Labour, which Labour will be happy about, +1 to Lib Dem. I would assume maybe that would be, it was more in my head. Maybe Lib Dem numbers are usually a little harder to track than the two main parties. And that +2 to Reform seems slightly bizarre, in my opinion. That might just be a kind of... Reform UK is kind of like... Is that like Lawrence Fox? Is that party there? Is that what I'm thinking of? Kind of UKIP-y?
Yes, Reform UK, despite their name, are a right-wing party. A right-wing populist political party. They were originally the Brexit party.
And they've kind of based some of their stuff on like anti-COVID rhetoric. So the longer it goes on and the longer that, there are still some signs up saying you have to wear a mask occasionally, I think you'll find some of those people dropping off the Conservatives and going over there. But personally, here we go, an eat my hat moment. I don't see them being a significant force come the next general election.
No, I think they've very much fallen back into that kind of where UKIP was, kind of like, now that we've touched on this before, I don't want to beat a dead horse or anything here. Very much as you said before, the Brexit-based parties, they've got Brexit done. So what's the point of them anymore? And that's very much what the Conservatives wanted to do, wanted to stop the split they were having in their voting base by doing that. And they've succeeded for now. I think there's always going to be an angry few in those kind of parties still, and that's why they're still there. But now I feel they've very much fallen down to the sidelines, and it's only when they manage to get themselves some big headlines for whatever reason that we'll see them resurfacing. We're very much back into the world of two-party politics, unfortunately. Not that I'm saying I would have liked the Brexit party to win, to be clear. But yes, we've gone very two-party again.
Maybe one of the more significant polls as well, or at least one that caught my eye, was one from YouGov from the 9th of September, which put Labour on 35%, the Conservatives on 33%, and the Lib Dems on 10%, which is the first Labour taking a lead in one of their polls since January this year. And that was kind of before the vaccine bounce, as we'd call it, where that was right in the middle of that second wave of COVID that was looking quite bad for the government back then. So I think that is kind of proof that this policy has certainly made an impact on voters. Just looking through this Twitter feed, it's got a lot of excellent stuff to share here. I would suggest that our listeners follow Britain Elects, because it is always a good source of it's a good source of data. There's a lot of politics that is spin and how you approach that, but sometimes looking at raw numbers is very useful, and they are very good at reporting on like every bizarre little by-election or council result that goes on as well. So I find that quite fun. But they've posted a piece that was from YouGov on the 24th of July, which showed a big drop in Conservative voting intention. And one of their analysts, Ben Walker here, says 1 in 5 of the 2019 Tory vote now says they're undecided.
Wow, that's a big number.
his take is that any Labour lead you see in the months to come will probably be a consequence of shaky Tory voters saying they won't vote, as opposed to many Conservatives moving to Labour. And I would broadly agree with that point. I feel that by-election that the Lib Dems won out of nowhere, and we said all the Conservatives should be wary about this. The tax plans that they've put out won't not only affect those people who maybe voted in those red walls the first time for Conservatives ever. They said, now's my time to vote Conservative. I've finally made the leap. Those might be shaky and going back to Labour now. But you've also got, there is a core of Conservative voters who live in Conservative Lib Dem marginals, and they tend to be more countryside based. And it's those blue wall seats, as they were called, or ones where Conservatives feel that they can we're going to win those. We can kind of neglect them slightly. These kind of tax policies where you've got lots of people living in those constituencies who are kind of like, no, you know what? I think I earn a lot of money. I would like to pay a little bit more tax for social care. They might also see the national insurance one as an unfair way to pay that, whereas they would rather have maybe pay a little bit more or see funds spent elsewhere. There's a lot of other things that they've clearly been upset about as well, and I don't feel this policy will do anything to make them happier either. So that's why I kind of suspect the Lib Dem vote to go up, or at least more people, like they say, move from Conservative to I'm not quite sure if I'll vote, or my vote is up for grabs next general election, that kind of policy. And it's that gradual eroding of support that can undermine you going into the future. So yeah, I think there is signs of actual data coming out there that this is a policy that is having a real impact on the electorate, a real impact on the Conservatives. Tremendous poll lead they've had since, for the first half of 2021. And it'll be interesting to see how Boris Johnson reacts to that. If he changes his tune, we know that Boris Johnson is, I believe he is a populist at heart, and that he will try and do whatever make the public happy. And this is certainly a policy that hasn't made the vast majority of the public very happy with his government.
For people who are in the Discord chat, and if you're not there, come join us on Discord. It's fun. We record here live. But I've just done a zoom and enhance on the Politico poll of polls. Right at the end there, there's a Conservative and Labour neck and neck data point that's come in very recently. So that is interesting to see. Obviously, the smoothed curve is not there. It's an average over the polls. So, let's not jump to conclusions based on that. But that is an interesting thing to see. So we will watch this poll's career with great interest. In fact, I've just found it. It's opinion research. It's 38% Conservatives, 38% Labour, and 8% Lib Dem is theirs. I think, I may be wrong, but it only lists 4 parties, those 3 in Greens. I wonder if that's one that doesn't give you the option for the other parties, which may be why it looks like that's why it looks like it's closer. Because if people can't pick the party they would vote for, they sometimes go for the nearest thing. I don't know how Opinion do their polls, but that might be what's going on there. But yes, you can see there that they're neck and neck, which is interesting. It's going to be interesting over the next few weeks. At this point, we normally move into the polls, but we've kind of done them this week. So I think that's probably it from us. We will be looking at the polls for the German general election soon, which have been all over the place over summer, but I think that probably is might be an episode focus than just a bit at the end here as we think about it. What do you think about that, Rob? Should we do a bit of a deep dive?
I would have to do research into the effect of the German election and the polls, because you could read some numbers at me and go, oh really, cool, and then I wouldn't have anything to say on them. So yeah, no, happy to brush over those for now.
Yeah, I think a thing to touch on in future episodes, maybe, I know we have few listeners who are German. If you wish to come on and tell us things, if you're politically minded and listen to this podcast, we have had guests on before who are listeners. So if you want to DM me, because you probably are on Discord if you're one of those German listeners I'm thinking of, feel free. So thank you for listening. As always, you can find us in all the usual places. That's at Unparl Podcast on Instagram and on Twitter. That's Unparliamentary Language on Facebook, and /r/unparliamentary on Reddit. And of course, if you like the show and want to throw a few dollars our way to get bonus content, we hinted there was some earlier in the episode, and there will be a full bonus content episode dropping in your feed soon, so you can see what that's like. Then head over to patreon.com/TTSS, where you can help pay for web hosting and microphones, and just to make this easier to run. for all of us. Maybe one day I could pay for someone else to do the editing. That'd be great. But maybe that's a long way off. So throw a few dollars our way. We appreciate it. Also, if you can't afford to give us a few dollars a month, then what you can do is you can go tell people about the podcast. Word of mouth is the best way to share it. Share it on Twitter, whatever. Retweet us. I don't mind. Basically, more listeners is good. If you enjoy it, someone else you know might enjoy it too. Please share the podcast. And I think that means there's nothing left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye with a delay.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. 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 Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open.